the approach to take, rules, explanations, what's proper, what's improper, how to name dancers, and so much more. Unfortunately, this last part is the part, all of this stuff, is what everybody tends to ignore. They get hooked on, how do I do this movement? I look up that movement, and that's as far as they go. There we go. That part is missed mainly because most callers have a number of reasons to say, well, this is how I was taught to do that movement. I don't need to read the definition. Or I read the definition only because that's what matters. The rest of the stuff is just administrative stuff. It's too cumbersome. You know, what do I care about the history? I want to know how to do the dance. Some callers actually are too lazy to go back and read the basic rules because they only call plus and above. I'll get a little comment on that one later. There's some that will say, I don't need to know that. The definition explains it anyway, and they'll just hand out the definition and say, well, I'm going to teach the call from how I know it. The definition will explain the rest of it. And as I said, any one of 800,000 or more reasons not to read the definitions. Callers that do this, in my opinion, are the same people that only love the made-for-TV versions of the book. I use the Lord of the Rings as an example. I have a copy of that, which I got when I was about 12 years old. I have read it probably 100 times, and I still read it. I enjoy the movie, but there's so much more in the book that I enjoy. So a made-for-TV or the Coles Notes versions or all that, that's not what the definitions and all the rest of that is for. You need the whole thing, and you need to look at it holistically. So as for many of these TV made-for-version books, it's enjoyable, but they're kind of like men sitting in front of TV with movies. And if you want to see the difference, watch a woman and watch a man watch a movie. Unless the man is really interested, they'll fast forward, skip the slow bits, ignore the character development bits. They'll watch the action car chase. They'll watch the fight scene. They'll watch the sex scene over and over again. And then they walk away and say that was a good movie. And they have no idea what the heck that was about. It's the same way with square dance calling. If that's the way you're going to use the definitions and the rules and the guidelines, you're cheating yourself, but more importantly, you're cheating the dancers from having the best experience they could possibly have by not telling them the rules, not giving them the guidelines of how to play the game. And those are the parts of reading the definition that this presentation is going to be about. So first off, we'll start with the basics of the definitions. Okay. The first movement on the basic program is, of course, what? Circle left. That's the first movement on every program, and you'll hear that over and over and over again. And yes, there are two parts when you talk basic one. There are two parts to basic one and basic two. And circle left is the first movement on both of them, and the mainstream and the plus and so on. Okay, the movement circle left doesn't occur until page 15 of the definitions. So you've got 14 pages that come before that, and you've got to wonder, well, what is so important that it takes 14 pages to say? Okay. Well, it's all the stuff that applies to every level from basic 1 through challenge 4. All that stuff before and after the actual definitions is about how to understand the definition. So we'll just quickly look at that. In the definitions, you've got a cover page. That just makes it look pretty. You got page 2, which is the table of contents. You look up a movement. It says it's on this page number. You go to that page. Page 4 is generally a blank page. It's a disclaimer. It says, you know, copyright laws and all that other kind of stuff. Page 5 is when we actually get into the alphabetical list of the calls, what's in there. So if I'm looking on page 5 of the definitions, I'll look up flutter wheel and it says, oh, 58. I go to page 58. The last page of the definitions is movement number 48, which is Ferris wheel. Okay, that doesn't happen until about page 60. So you got from page 15 to page 60 are the actual definitions, but there's even more after page 60. So that's all the stuff that I want to concentrate on, and that's all the stuff that very few callers actually think about or talk about or even read for that matter. Come on. Here we go. From page 5 to page 15, there's 10 pages of information that are rarely looked at. Okay, and that's where you actually get into the meat of the document, how to read the document, how to call square dancing, all these things that apply to every single definition that's in that document. On page 6, there's a general paragraph that says the definitions describe in detail what you need to know to call the movements. Also on page 6, there's a basic history about the dance programs, how they came about, and why we have the definitions, why they're standardized like they are. On page 6 and 7, you get the scope of the definitions, and that explains, that these definitions are not just for callers, they're for both callers and dancers. They talk about the description of the call, the command examples, the styling, the timing, determining what or what may not be acceptable. And, I try and spend a bit of time on this particular section because I'm just going to read this to you from the Caller Lab point of the definitions. It says, these definitions are neither new dancer manual nor a new caller manual, nor are they written to allow an isolated group who has never square danced before acquire this skill easily. The definition of a call may not be the best way to teach a call. I'll read that again. The definition of a call may not be the best way to teach a call, which seems kind of contrary to what definitions are about, but even Caller Lab recognizes that how you teach it and how it's written may not be exactly the same. Then it also says, by the same tokens, the words used to best teach a call or quickly remember a call are not necessarily good, precise, or the complete definition. Basically what that's saying is Caller Lab recognizes that the definition is there to explain how to do the movement. It's not the technicalities of how to do a movement. Turn 270 degrees and others, rotate 90 degrees in a clockwise form. It's going to lose people. But saying cast 3 and the ends move up is not necessarily the best way to teach a movement either. So you have to find that balance, and that's recognized. And each caller generally finds their own way. Page 7 talks about the approach, and this is important. The approach used in making the definitions, but suffice it to say, they are for both callers and dancers. The definitions are designed to bridge that area between caller knowledge and dancer knowledge. So in that aspect, it would be important to make sure that your dancers have a copy of the definitions or they know where to get them. Not to study them, not to memorize them, but to help them understand it. The definitions also talk on page 7 about standardization, which essentially means that the document is a guide for callers everywhere and dancers everywhere to use so that they're all doing it relatively the same way, so that all dancers can dance the same way all over the world. I say relative because in 1992, Caller Lab came up with that wonderful expression, Caller Lab recognizes regional difference in styling exists. This basically meant it started off with a hands up, hands down ocean waves, but it also goes to things like the chicken wing Alaman left here in Australia, or the full forearm grip for ocean waves that you cannot do a box the net from. The excuse that that's just a regional difference has become the klaxon call for I don't want to change, or I don't want to do something or change the way I do it because it might be easier. We always done it this way. This is the way we're going to keep doing it. There are problem areas in the definitions, however, and the next few pages include some of those, and that's unfortunately the part many callers skip. Page 7 also includes a section called proper versus improper. The terms improper and proper are used to describe applications of calls that are not in accordance with the definitions and who Caller Lab and those use that Caller Lab discourages, that don't do this. I want to clearly state, proper and improper are not legal and illegal. There is no such thing as square dance police. It doesn't exist. Okay? You're not going to get arrested if you do a square through wrong or you courtesy turn on your square through. Okay? It basically means that dancers spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of practice learning and being communicated with by their callers. And callers should be able to tell the dancers what they want to do, what they want the dancers to do, without resorting to some kind of technical mechanics and scientific terminology and analyzing the individual parts just to prove a point that, oh yes, you can do it this way, or no, you can't do it this way. The definitions are general uses that have pretty much all the work done for you already. It's about getting the message to the dancers and giving them a simple, straightforward, and clear direction that's understandable without having to conduct a technical seminary or a theological seminary, or preferably without having an argument. The next page is what we start getting into the meat of this presentation. These are the rules and conventions. I'll look at these in a little more detail, but I'll just suffice it to say we'll just touch what they are. There's 3 pages that talk about 6 rules and conventions. There's 5 rules and 1 convention. These are so very important, and they're what the presentation is about, mainly because they apply to every single level of dancing. It doesn't matter if you're a basic level dancer or a challenge 4 level dancer. Okay. The first one is the passing rule, which tells you how to safely pass another dancer if you're going to run into each other. The second one is the same position rule. It says, if you're going to occupy the same place, what do you do? Or when should you not occupy the same place for callers? Something that most callers are usually tend to avoid when they get into the really technical aspects. The facing couple rule tells us that we treat facing couples, we treat ocean waves as facing couples even when they're not. The ocean wave rule says we treat ocean waves as if they're facing couples even when they're not. And that applies to specific movements, and they get spelled out. The squared set convention is basically about who goes in and what do they do when they're in there. Do they stay in the middle or do they back out? And an ongoing argument all the time. If I call heads square through 3, do they come back to the home position or do they stay in the middle? If I call heads pass through, do they go stand on the other opposite side facing out, or do they stay in the middle? That's what that's all about. And then there's the circle rule, which is all about turning the circle into a square by the use of some calls. Circle left, heads into the middle and back, or heads half sachet, circle left, 4 boys into the middle and back. I turn it into a square from a circle. That section basically says the conventions or rules are there for commonality and understanding. That's so everybody everywhere can understand the basic principles. And callers that make choreography should read the rules and use good judgment if they're going to do something that's in conflict with those 5 rules and that 1 convention. Okay. Page 10 tells us ways of naming dancers. Now, this wouldn't seem to be a very important section at a glance, but it is. And believe it or not, there's 5 pages dedicated. Page 10 to 15 is dedicated to how to name dancers: boys, girls, centers, ends, heads, sides, couples, different pairings, partners, corners, in faces, out faces, very centers, so forth and so on. Okay. If you haven't been using those terms with your dancers and using them correctly, I highly recommend going back and reading those 5 pages again. They have meaning, they're very important, but they also explain the relationships from different formations and setups with the proper terminology. And that's what the dancers refer to. That's why they're important, because how you refer to them for the dancers is how, if I'm calling, I'm going to go to, Gerhard's dance, and I'm going to say ends and centers, they're going to know exactly what I'm going to say. If I say side man and your corner, they're going to know exactly who I'm talking about. I can't make stuff up and expect the dancers to know it. So those conventions are there. Those namings are there. Use them. On page 15, there's also an explanation of how the definition works. And believe it or not, at basic and mainstream, the definitions have 8 parts. 1 is the name of the call. That's how it's listed on the program. Number 2 is the starting formation. That's except when impractical. All the starting formations are listed. Okay? So for instance, if I say square through, my starting formation is facing couples or ocean wave. I'll have those kinds of descriptions of where I can do that from. In rare cases, the word only appears in the starting formation. That's an important word that a lot of callers overlook. If it says only from ocean waves, or only from standard couples, or facing couples, normalized boy on the left, girl on the right, right and left through is a great example of that, because there's limitation on where and when you can call it. Past the ocean, it might say only at mainstream, or only at basic and mainstream. If it says the word only, use the word only. Don't try and push it. Okay. All the formations used in the definitions are in the formations appendix, and you can find that on the Collar Lab website, or you can find that at the end of the definitions. Further commentary on the starting formations can be found in the additional details section at the end of the definitions, but right now they're under rewrite, so they just refer you to the appendixes. Number 3 is the command examples. These are most of the common phrases used to call that particular movement. The simplest and most common are listed first, and then some of the other ones may help, and they'll include some patter or some helping words. And you can see additional detail, another section of the definition for command extra words. Number 4 is the dance action. That's a description of how to do the call, either in English words or in English, in other languages, whatever the definitions are written at, and the combination of both. Complex calls are described sequentially, following part by part by part by part. And they'll tell you what the first part is, what the second part is. The descriptions are written to work from all of the standard starting formations that they list. They try and capture in words the essence of that particular call. Okay. The ending formation is number 5. Now, the ending formations are given so that the readers can double check their understanding of the call. And when I say the readers, I don't say the callers, I say the readers. That's the dancers and the callers. And all the formations used in that definition are found in the formations appendix. Timing. This one is so horrendously overlooked by so many callers. Timing. When executing the call, dancers should take 1 step for each beat of the music. So the number of steps or the number of beats is determined by the timing committee of Collar Lab, and they say, right, it should take this number of beats to do the music, or to do this movement. So square through, for example, from a static square is 10 beats of music. It should take 10 beats of music to do it. When you teach square through, it may take 32 beats for everybody to get square through the first time to understand the movement. If it does, take 32 beats so that they all under it. But when you start dancing it, there's nothing wrong with saying square through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you're done. They've got to know that they've got to move to the beat and do the actual timing the way it's written. Once you sort that timing out and moving to the music, 60 to 80% of your problems with the movements will disappear. Another one that's been dropped off the list lately is styling. The recommended styling, including the arm position, the hand holds, the skirt work, all of that stuff is given for each of those movements. But we've tended to walk away from teaching styling, which is an important part of the movement, and traded it off for see if you can get to the right position before the timing restriction ends. Please don't do that. Look at the styling. It's important to the movements. And finally, there's a section on comments, and that's just important information, clarifications, exceptions, usages, all of those things that are contained in it. Okay. The next section is the actual definitions. Okay. Now, we may come back to those later if there's time, but that's not part of this presentation. We're not going to go through all the movements and say this is defined as and what it means. We can have that as a separate discussion. But in the definitions are all the stuff surrounding them. It is all that stuff that's surrounding them. Those 15 pages at the start and the rest of it at the end that very rarely get read and are unfortunately so important to understanding the definitions that we create problems on our own backs, especially if a dancer reads it, because you will have dancers that will read them and ask you questions. And if you haven't read it and understand it, there's no way you can answer. Okay? So the definitions go basically from page 16 to 60. This is just the basic program I'm talking about here. And then we get into the additional detail. Page 61 has the starting formations, what to do with the calls. Then you got commands, then you got dance actions, then you've got the timing, then you got the styling. These are just additional details that are at the end to help you understand how to do the definitions. Okay, page 64 also has the appendixes. Okay, Appendix A is all about formations, and those are Collar Lab recommended documents. Okay, now you won't find those on the definitions right now, but they do refer you to the documents, and they're all on the Collar Lab website. Page 64 also has Appendix B, which is descriptive terminology, and that explains what's used in the definition. And it's basically a lexicon or a dictionary that refers to specific words that are used, such as adjacent. Adjacent doesn't always mean the one beside you. It could have different meanings depending on where you are. Couples, what is a couple? Is it a boy, is it a girl? Is it two dancers stand by side? Is it a couple in a mini wave? Face left, face right, face out, face in. What's home? Using the word left as a prefix or opposite, and how to dance things like pull by. What does reverse mean? What a set or a square is. Who's the right hand lady and where? What are fractions? What does those who can mean, and so on and so on and so forth. You've got Appendix C, which is additional publication and resources. Right now in the basic program, those are empty, but almost all of the publication resources that relate to the definitions are all available on the Color Lab website. I'm not, I guess I am in some ways using it as a product placement for the Color Lab website, but all that material is there. That should be the source you go to. There are a lot of good sources out there. Vic Cedars' website has a lot of definitions. Taminations has a lot of definitions. A lot of others have a lot of definitions, but they are not the Color Lab definition all the time. It could be a truncated version, it could be a shortened version, it could be somebody's interpretation, depending on where you go. So I highly recommend you go to Color Lab as the source for your definitions. They are updated quite frequently. I was talking to a very experienced caller not long ago, and he was still working off the 1991 version of the mainstream program definitions. There's been a lot of changes since 1991. Okay, and finally on 67 is the history of the changes. Most people don't look at that. It is important because it explains that from time to time, these lists get modified. Some of these things are still works in process, others need clarifications. Now, when we look at the mainstream program, the same thing happens, okay? All the definitions that are at basic, they apply. The mainstream program has exactly the same opening and closing as the basic program. It's got all those same pages before it. The plus program, and this is why I have a few issues with the plus program the way it's done, and this is, in my opinion, a big mistake they've made. They give a very shortened version to reinforce the rules, because basic and mainstream program are part of the plus program, and all the rules apply. Unfortunately, we get a lot of callers out there that pull the plus definitions. There's no rules, there's none of this in front of it, so they don't read it because, oh, this doesn't apply. We can dance basic and mainstream. It's shortened because rather than just say, see basic and mainstream rules or definitions, it should say, these are important, here's a short refresher. What's also different is the plus definitions are, is that rather than 8 parts, they now consist of a start formation, timing, dance action, and styling. That's it. That's all that's in the plus definitions. And you can download all these definitions from the Color Lab website. When you get back to the advanced program, however, they suddenly realize, you know what, maybe we should reinforce these basic rules because it's important at a higher level program. I guess because it's so important that after plus dancing, to remind the dancers that they have to be able to dance good basic and mainstream if you want to be able to dance advanced or higher level dances. The appendixes and extra terms are not there because if you don't know them by now, chances are you wouldn't be dancing that level anyway. But advanced says you have to be able to dance good basic, good mainstream, understand the definitions and understand the rules if you want to dance this level. For some reason, the plus program doesn't say that. And if it doesn't say it, some callers think it doesn't apply. Wrong, it does apply. I don't dance challenge, I don't call challenge, but I really like what they did with the challenge definition. It's the first time that Color Lab actually says that the definitions are there to refer disputes in interpretation to what a call means. Okay, it also says, before you use these definitions, you should be familiar with the Color Lab basic and mainstream definitions, the Color Lab plus definitions, the Color Lab advanced definitions, the Color Lab standard formation names, and where possible, we have used the calls and formations to define these documents. This has let us make the definitions shorter and clearer. It actually says that in the challenge definitions. Okay, so that's all we're going to talk about the first part of that. Now, if you wish to look at a specific definition or interpretation, like I said, we can do that later. I only call up to A1, so if you want to go over that, I'll have to defer those questions. It's not a negative or anything like that. That's just a choice I made a long time ago. So if your question is about tally-ho from the C1 list, I'll have to defer that to somebody that actually calls C1. Okay. The next part of this presentation is about the rules and the conventions. It was actually Jeff Seidel, and I think you're here, Jeff, yes. It was just an offhand question I made, and it generated 11 emails and personal messages asking the same thing. Strangely enough, all but 2 of them were from callers that I feel to be pretty experienced callers, and they expressed that no one is really teaching this important piece of caller knowledge to new callers anymore. So I went back and I looked at all the school curriculums I could find for the last 20 years, and they were right. Although it's mentioned, I know Ken Rituzzi mentions it at the New England Caller School about reading the rules, reading the definitions they apply. There's no real session on that particular topic. I will also note that that was only a quick internet search, not an exhaustive search. So if I'm wrong there, I do apologize. But that's part of the reason I decided to make this the focus of the topic. So when we look at conventions and rules, as I said, in the definitions, there's 5 basic rules and 1 convention, and they apply to all square dancing, regardless of the program that's being called. There are a few other conventions, which I may touch on, and they get taken as rules, but I'll mention those at the end. A convention, however, you've got to understand what the difference is. A convention in dance terms means this is the way we've always done it, so this is the way we do it. A rule is different in that it says, it refers to an explicit and understood method or a specific principle which governs the conduct or process of a specific action applicable to a certain set of criteria. So if they meet that set of standards, the rule applies. In other words, they have to meet A, B, and C in order to do D. It's a rule. A convention is, well, this is the way we always do it, so this is the way everybody does it. This is the way we teach it. That's how we're going to do it from now on. So, caution. If a convention is the normal way of doing things by enough dancers, it may eventually change into a rule or become a revised definition. But there's a big risk on that. And I'm sure everybody's probably thinking, I'll have a couple of movements, but the one that really strikes to my mind is, for a long time, the movement recycle was taught as girls turn back, wheel and deal. That was the way it was called. That was the way it was taught. That was almost a convention. And then that could have easily become a rule if that's what people argued about. Thank God it didn't happen, and let's hope it never happens. But that's one of the dangers of conventions. When something like that happens, and it does, a new rule is used to create choreography, which sometimes is in conflict with the convention that led to that rule. If that happens, we end up with chaos, arguments, applications, and sometimes dancers and callers just quit or go off doing their own thing. Now, where that becomes important is there's callers, and I believe Dawn is here. I can't see who's actually in the list because I don't have that screen up. But Dawn wrote half of some of the most popular movements as far as I know, but one in particular is Ferris wheel. You know, if he didn't follow a set of guidelines and a set of dancing instructions, and this was before these rules and conventions actually came about, we would have had chaos. If he didn't put any definitions or any guidelines for it, we would have had chaos, and people would be doing Ferris wheel for motion waves and all sorts of different things. But he followed the general dynamics of how dancers are dancing, the general conventions and the rules at the time, and he come up with new choreography. And that's what those rules are for. The rules apply, especially if you're going to be writing new stuff. So callers, always exercise caution and good judgment when you create choreography, especially new choreography. And if you try to use the rules, or always try to use the rules the way they're written. If you want to do it differently, then you've got to clarify very specifically in the definition of your new movement. And I refer to Don Beck and Ferris wheel as the example. That's an excellent example of how to write a definition. I don't know particularly, Don may be able to answer that one later, if that's what he intended, but it's a very well-written movement. The importance of a convention is it has 2 dancers on the same path. This is Where are we? Use core. Oh, I've already done that. Um, okay. The importance of the convention of 5 rules is when you're doing that, it's important to be specific. And you'll see this in the existing Caller Lab definitions. There are mistakes in them. They're written by people and people make mistakes. But something as simple as a missing comma can really change the meaning of a message, and the same thing applies. So if you read, let's eat grandpa or let's eat grandpa, that comma makes a big difference in what you want to say. The same thing applies to the definition. So you don't want to be mixing them up, and you don't want to be really, really badly messing around with the rules. So the first rule is the passing rule. Now it says, if a definition has 2 dancers on the same path and requires them to walk past each other, they pass right shoulders. If you want them to pass left shoulders or do the mirror image, you've got to use left. Pretty straightforward. That's one rule. The second is the same position rule. This one is violated so often at the higher levels, especially by newer callers. If 2 dancers have to occupy the same spot at the end of the hall and are facing opposite directions, they make a right-hand mini-wave. Okay? They just adjust. If the adjustment is necessary, and this is the part most people, they adjust sideways towards the outside of the group in which they are working. Okay? They don't try and cram in together. Now, this is another one. Callers should not use a call that results in 2 dancers that are facing the same direction or at right angles, such as a T-bone if you're looking at someone's shoulder. Should never try and force those dancers to occupy the same spot. For instance, an example from lines facing out, circulate once and a half takes us to a tidal wave. That's a good example of the same position rule, because it moves us around and they have to occupy that same spot. So they adjust and they make that tidal wave. The facing couple rule, or as I like to call it, I'm not in a wave, but treat me like I'm in a wave rule. Okay? There's a few specific calls that are defined to start from ocean waves, but are also proper starting from facing couples. Examples like spin the top, swing through, etc. Okay? In this case, the dancers step to a momentary right-hand wave, and then they complete the call. So if a caller directs a left swing through, the same rule applies, facing couples, but they step to a left-hand wave. The facing couple rule is applicable when the call's definitions in the document will have it. Let me rephrase that. If the facing couple rule is applicable, the definition that's in the document will say the facing couple rule applies. Okay? The important part is if it doesn't say that, do not use the facing couple rule. So it has to say it. If it doesn't, don't use it. It doesn't apply. It's considered improper. It may not be right. You may not agree with it, but that's the convention. And there's a way of changing it. But that's the rules across the board. So stick with them. While the rule is called the facing couple rule, it's generalized to include facing dancers stepping to a right-hand mini-wave or a left-hand mini-wave, etc. And as you can see from these things, you get sometimes mixed formations. The facing couple rule would apply to this. So they may be holding hands, they may be not, but I could easily say swing through from there. They would step to the momentary wave, these guys, and they would finish it like a normal swing through. So don't be hesitant to mess around with this stuff, but you can bend these, but don't break them. The next is the ocean wave rule, or as I call it, I'm not in a wave, but pretend I am. Sorry, this is the I'm not in facing couples, but pretend I'm in. Some calls are defined to start from facing couples, and they're also proper to start from right-hand waves. For instance, right and left through can be called from a wave, or it can be called from facing couples. The same with square through. In these cases, the dancers have already stepped in, they've already taken the hands, they've already got the wave. That means that you can call a facing couple movement. Sometimes this rule applies to specific levels. When I say that, Past the Ocean is a classic example. Past the Ocean is a facing couple call. You cannot call Past the Ocean at basic or mainstream. Okay, it's improper. But the definition comment says it may be applied to other programs. Okay, so if you're calling a plus dance and you call pass the ocean, it's perfectly legal. My opinion is you'd be a jerk if you did that, but that's just a personal opinion. You know, if you want pass the ocean and then another pass the ocean, well, you should have called a different call to begin with. Okay, examples where it can be used, right and left through is standard wave. The ocean wave rule applies to trade by from a 3/4 tag. Yes, you can do that there. Right and left grand, yes. Double pass through, yes. Square through, all of those things. Where it cannot be used is circulates. People ask me all the time, well, what, you're in an ocean wave, you can circulate from there. The reason they say it cannot be used from circulates is if you want people to do a circulate from an ocean wave, you want them to circulate forward to the next position. That's a path circulate. You're going from one position to the next. The fact you're in an ocean wave is really not the important part. If you want to call circulate from an ocean wave and expect them to do a step through, then that is wrong. Okay. For the sake of dancer comprehension and teaching purposes, it's necessary to have the dancers back up into facing couple sometimes and then step back into the wave so they can actually see what they're doing. But in order for the ocean wave rule to apply, the initial dance action of the call must start with box the net, pass through, or right pull by. In addition, it must not be defined to have a different dance action from an ocean wave. Okay, so it has to have that kind of a setup where if you're going to call a circulate, it can't go contrary to what the ocean wave is going to actually do. And it's got to be one of those formations where you can call box and nat or pass through or a right pull by. That's just for the ocean wave, or left pull by if you're in left-hand ocean waves. That's where that rule applies. Hopefully that's clear as mud. Now, circulates are the confusing one. So for instance, the calls circulate from an 8-chain through and from ocean waves. It would be improper to call circulate from ocean waves and expect the dancer to do a step through based on the ocean wave rule, because they would naturally apply to the definition to circulate from ocean waves. They'd move forward to the next formation. For instance, that mini wave that you see there, and facing dancers starting, while unusual, is also proper. You could either call a swing through or a grand swing through or a right and left through from there, or you could even call a swing through from there. Of course, you'd be a jerk if you called it. But the adjustment is part of the ocean wave rule. So the rule doesn't change to affect the call. It neither adds or subtracts or changes the definition. It all fits in there, so the rule would apply. It is if any dancers in a mini wave had first stepped back into facing dancers and they did the call. So for instance, from a right-hand mini wave, see where they're in the right-hand mini wave here? If I wanted to call do, si, do, or right and left through, they would just step back. If they just take that little step back, yes, they could do the right and left through. Can they do a box and that from there? Yes. Can they do a pass through from there? Yes, they can. So that rule would apply. Extensions like reverse wheel around and then half the dancers are in a mini wave and the other half of the dancers are facing dancers. You know, if they can still do box net, slide through, or pass through, then you can use it. And the other thing is, remember, if you have to step in, the ocean wave rule does not change the timing of the call. Okay. The squared set convention, this is the one where you have a squared set, but do I stay in the middle or do I not stay in the middle? Okay. Basically, you have to identify who's active and who's inactive. And the question is, do the active dancers move forward into the center and execute the call? If they end facing the same walls as the inactive dancer, they remain in the center. So if I do head square through, they're facing the inactives, they stay in the center. If the call ends with the active dancers not facing the same walls, for instance, head square through 3, okay, they stay in the center unless they're, or sorry, they exit the center unless there's a clear reason for them to stay. So what it says is if you call heads square through 3, the dancer should return to the squared set positions, or same thing for head ladies chain or whatever, unless there's a reason for them to stay in the center. For instance, calling box the gnat. Well, they stay in the center because they've got their hands joined. Usually the end position is obvious for the next call anyway. So if I say heads right and left through, sides right and left through, the heads are automatically, they have to step out because the sides have to go in. But if I say heads square through 3, separate, they step out. But hopefully that will be part of the flow and part of the action. Moving into the center adds 2 beats to the movement. So note that you need that time. So you have to look at, so if I'm doing a right and left through during the courtesy turn, it's going to be overlap with the next call. So as in heads right and left through, sides right and left through. I've got to overlap that. So that facing couple calls add 2 beats, especially from a static square. The circle rule. The circle rule is basically you're in a circle, treat it like a square, depending on what the call is. So if you got an in-facing circle of 8 and you name two dancers that are adjacent to each other, what happens is they become either heads or sides or whatever. They become the active dancers. And the best way to explain that is from a squared set, join hands, circle left, heads up to the middle and back. They may be in the side position, they may be at an angle. But as soon as I identify heads up and back, they've now become the active dancers. The rest of the square stops and it becomes a static square wherever it's oriented. And the same thing, I could say heads roll away, or heads half sachet, circle left, 4 boys do this, or 4 girls do that. Those girls become a couple. That circle then becomes a square, and you just adjust it accordingly. The good news is that's a lot of stuff. But those 6 rules, the 5 rules in that one convention, they apply to all levels. They do not change. Where the rules apply is usually defined, and the qualifiers at different levels are clearly stated. Okay, they're clearly written out for you, and if you take the time to actually read the definitions, the whole document, you'll get through it. The last part of this is the guidelines. There's a document called the Choreographic Guidelines, and that's also found on the Color Lab website. I've been talking to a number of callers, and I think all but 4 have actually read the guidelines. Most of them didn't even know they existed. And these are not the Color Lab guidelines, these are choreographic guidelines. And they cover things like the 2-beat rule, or flow, hand availability, smoothness, variety, timing, all these other kinds of things. These are what we call the soft aspects of dancing and the soft aspects of calling. These are what make it work. Okay, and I'll just go quickly through a couple of these. The first is the 2-beat rule. That deals with command time. The amount of command time given to a move so it can be executed should normally not take more than 2 beats. Now, we all know there's exceptions to that rule, such as spin, chain, and exchange the gears. If you can get that out in 2 beats, you're doing better than I am. Spin, chain, through, 3 beats, but you try and truncate that down into 2. Most of the time, it's all about lead time for the dancers. Okay. The second is the smoothness rule. That relates to body flow. And it basically says you got to choose material that allows the dancers to move smoothly from one movement to the next. You want to have the dancers positioned at the completion of one call so the transition can be accomplished without an abrupt direction change. To meet that, you've got to consider space available for the movement and the type of movement, whether or not you're moving forward, what is there a rotation, all that other kind of stuff. There's also called a variety exception to that, where the smoothness rule is intentionally broken. The elements of variety, interest, and choreographic challenges are also important to dancers. So sometimes a deliberate violation of the smoothness rule can provide excitement and variety where you wouldn't normally have them, but it's also of equal importance to the dancers. Unfortunately, that exception excuse is overused, and it explains a lot why dancing is not smooth. Walk and dodge partner trade is a good example. There's nothing wrong with walk and dodge partner trade. There is something wrong with walk and dodge partner trade if that's all you ever do and you abuse it and you use it. Okay, the rules of smoothness are complex, and there's too few callers that concern themselves with it or how to bring smoothness to the dancers. Okay, there's another one called the rule of alternating hands or alternating shoulders. That's pretty self-explanatory. Means if I do a right hand call, I should do a left hand call. If I do a right and left through, I may not want to do a square through. If I do a star through and a right and left through, why does that work? Why does not something else not work? Well, star through, right and left through has to do with hand position. When you finish a star through, your hand's in the right position. But if I do right and left through, star through, my hand's not in the right position. That's the rules of alternating hands. And I really strongly suggest you read that section because it is important for the dancers. And all of this is about the dancers. There's the difficult choreography convention. That you see usually at the higher levels, and common ways in which difficulty is added to a square dance is through the use of unfamiliar moves or unfamiliar formations and arrangement, unusual use of the rules or a combination of those rules. Okay. Putting it deliberately behind you or extending choreography should be to increase the pleasure of the dancers. And that's the basic tenet of that. If you're going to use difficult choreography, make sure it's for the dancer's pleasure, not for the caller's pleasure. I can't stress that enough. It's a special challenge in that type of dancing, so success will bring special pleasure to those types of dancers. This is why challenge dancing, you know, they look like they're thinking and they're demanding and their heads down, and you know, it doesn't look like they're having a great time. It's just a whole different way. But if you don't think of the dancers first, failure is not only disastrous for the dancers, but it's equally disastrous for the caller. So make sure you get full knowledge of the techniques before you start playing with that kind of stuff. The building block rule is basically create a foundation first and build on it. That's been gone over and over again. If you're going to come up with something weird and wonderful, it should be building from something they know into something they don't know and something that puts it all together for them. Start small, build big. The weaning rule is all about cluing and cueing. Clues are provided, clues or hints to the dancers, okay? Clues do not normally contain part of the definition. So I might say, ladies hinge, look at your diamond. Okay, that's a clue. That's not part of the definition. Cues, however, usually contain part of the definition. So you might say, do a do, si, do, it's back to back. Or do a do, passo, turn partner left, corner by the right, partner left. Okay, I'm including part of the definition. That's the difference between cueing and cluing. There's a strong caution on cueing, mainly because some dancers may never learn the move and they simply listen for the cues and that's what they dance to. And that's how they associate it. And you can call do passo and they're going to stand there waiting for you to say partner left, corner right, partner left, and so on. They're to be used sparingly and they're both supposed to be weaned off, hence it's called the weaning rule. Extra time convention, I've mentioned that before. If it takes you 30 beats of music to get square through the first time, take 30 beats of music. But what you want to do is make sure that you get them back to the time. But the extra time convention also says you can provide additional lead time by delaying the delivery of movements. You know, you can do men star left. And if your music goes turn a partner right and back to the corner, Alaman left, but you can say men star left, delay, delay, delay until they're there, turn a partner right and corner left, do an Alaman left, you know, or what have you. Delay that delivery so that it's better for the dancers. You're just giving them a little bit of extra time. So from a static square, if I said head star through and pass the ocean, sides working down the wave with each other, do the right and left through. I've now given that little extra time in the modification. I've done a little bit of clarification for the dancer's success. And that's what takes us into the modification convention. That applies when callers fractionalize or suspend the completion of a movement to do something else. That use very, very cautiously, but we do it all the time. There's a tendency to modify definitions and it's growing all the time and it's very hard for the dancers to keep up with it. So this rule simply states, if you're going to change something, make sure it's clear what you want. A good example is square through, but on the third hand, or load the boat, but centered, stop in the wave, as opposed to saying as a couple as opposed to as couples can be used to modify at every level. So you can say as a couple, do the right and left through, but that's not as couples because that has a completely definition. So be careful when you're modifying that those terminologies aren't available at different, or they aren't being used elsewhere. The give them space rule, dancers do not like to be squeezed into tight areas. They cannot dance smoothly. It involves two couples in the center of the set, and it can be either smooth or not smooth depending on the combination. So example from starting double pass through formation, if I say center swing through, it's smooth, they've got room to move. But if I take that same formation, for instance, from line pass through wheel and deal, I now have a double pass through formation, and I say centers pass the ocean swing through, it's generally crowded in there. The sides or the outsides have to move back. The same thing if I call flutter wheel or a lady's chain. Lady's chain is not comfortable. Flutter wheel, a little more comfortable because the man steps sideways and leads the lady across. You have to think about that. You've also got what's known as the momentum rule. This one is broken so often, or it's ignored when you're calling and choosing the next call. And that's the tendency of dancers. Where an object is in motion, it stays in motion. So the tendency is dancers continue to move in an established, usually forward direction. Sequences that enhance that kind of forward flow are more comfortable than sequences that don't. For instance, if I call head star through, double pass through, centers in, bend the line, it's very, very uncomfortable because the centers go forward and then they suddenly have to stop and they have to back up and bend the line. They're totally breaking momentum. But I can get the same thing saying head star through, double pass through, put centers in, cast off 3/4. That momentum is still forward. And for the dancer that steps sideways, it's a pivot. So the momentum rule would apply. Now finally, because there are a lot of rules, we need some kind of judiciary. As I said before, there's no square dance police, but there is the Applications Review Committee. Now the ARC, as it's commonly referred to, that only formed in 1998. And that was to review the use of improper use of square dance calls, because people would read the definitions, put their own interpretation on it, and say, well, this is fine, it meets the definition. Somebody had to make a decision. So what they got was a bunch of fairly knowledgeable callers from all over the world that they reviewed the written requests from callers and dancers that said, is this right or is this wrong? Now that's important because some of these questions come in from dancers, not just callers. And dancers will actually write to the Caller Lab ARC and say, our caller called this, we don't think it's right. Can you tell us? And sometimes they get an answer and say, you know what, your caller is wrong. Take this back and tell them. As I said before, all callers on the ARC, they agree to abide by the decision, whether or not they agree. If it's a group decision, they will agree to abide by it. The committee, however, the ARC is reactive. It's not proactive. Those are the actual definitions committees and the level committees. But the ARC is there to act as interpreter and judge. They make a decision, and that's essentially the way it is. We said before, there are no square dance police, but these guys are about as close as you can get to making a decision. Now, I say that. You notice down here it says appeals are possible. The ARC is combined of callers. They are people that make a decision based on what's given them. They don't always get it right, and sometimes there's been times where their decisions get reversed. But they have been, in my opinion, one of the greatest assets in reducing the misuse of calls over the years by saying, yes, it's proper, or no, it's not proper. And then now there's 4 centers and 4 outside dancers. Okay, it's superseded. So things change. Go back and look at these ARC documents, and you'll find that they are just that, living documents. Now there's a few resources there. I suggest if you're not at or part of the Caller Lab program, or if you saw, I think it was Barry Clasper's presentation, he put up links to the Caller Lab website. All of these documents and everything else are there, but the particular ones are the definitions and the guidelines. I strongly suggest you get those and you read them, because it will help you in your calling. So that's the presentation. Oh, look at that. I hit it exactly 1 hour on the nose, to the second. I'm impressed. Looks like Lars has gone to sleep on us in Sweden.
Okay, Mel, do you want me to stop recording now or continue?
Like I said, it's up to you. We're going to open the floor now. I do apologize. This is a very, very, very dry topic. It's probably one of the reasons why nobody wants to cover this particular topic. Trying to get rid of my PowerPoint presentation here. There you go. It's probably one of the reasons why nobody really covers this topic in detail, because it is a long and a dry topic, but it is so very, very important that you understand the premise of why these definitions are written that way, why the calls are written the way they are, and what's all this stuff that goes in behind it. For too long, too many callers are interpreting the definitions so loosely that it creates problems for dancers. By the same token, by following the definitions properly, you can set up some very, very good variety in use of calls and extend the application as long as you're within the definition. And if you follow that, it's going to be clear to the dancers, because the dancers should know this, the passing rule and the basic 5 rules and that one convention, as well as you as a caller know, because you will be teaching them that from the very first night. So the floor is open if anybody has any questions.
And y'all can unmute yourselves. Okay, I'll lead off. I had one from early in the topic.
Mm-hmm.
What's a chicken wing a la man left?
It's something that I had to get used to when I moved here to Australia. In Australia, I don't know if you can see it. I went to a dance and I do an a la man left like this with a forearm. I do my ocean waves with my hands crossed palm. I went a la man left like this, and everybody was like this. And they crossed their hands and they put their hands together. It gives you a nice tight turn, but I call that a chicken wing, because you get somebody that's a little bit stronger than somebody that puts a lot of pressure on the elbow. But it is a regional difference. It's something that happens here in Australia an awful lot. It's not an arm down with a forearm turn. It's a chicken wing turn.
Well, that's more like a left-hand star.
It is, but you're doing it. Oh, damn it.
As a matter of fact, I've taught it that way before too. Only as a left-hand star. And then we graduate to a la man left later on.
Yeah. I just realized that I have to save that as a PDF in order to attach it. So bear with me for 1 second. I've just got to save this as a PDF file.
I was picturing it when you said it. I was picturing you were going to be going in like this with your elbow to elbow or something.
Now, I call it a chicken wing a la man left, because the chicken wing, it's actually used in wrestling, and done like this. If you know about body mechanics and kinesiology, if you put 2 arms like that, okay, it takes about 3 pounds. If that elbow is blocked, it takes about 3 pounds of pressure to dislocate somebody's elbow. My opinion, it's dangerous, but it's no different than some of the other ways. You see the ocean waves where the hands are back and they're all in a straight line. It's an easy way to dislocate a shoulder. And that's very, very common in the States.
Just a point of humor there, Mel. I think Mark's made a new COVID variation of the term. Elbows up.
Yeah. The pigeon or chicken wing came into Australia by Joe Lewis from Texas. He actually introduced it, and there are quite a number of clubs in the US that still use that form. Now, I could ask the question then, why do we pass by the right shoulders when you, in America, drive on the wrong side of the road?
Don't think that that thought hasn't crossed my mind before.
I can actually answer that one. Okay, I've loaded the presentation and the speaking notes into the chat window if you wanted to download them there. And
Twice you have.
And if you can't download it from there, that's my email address. Just send me an email asking for the presentation. I can email them out to you. But as to the right hand, it's because most people are right-handed. And it's got no other reason for that other than it's the way most things are done. A lady is usually on the right-hand side of a man, so that the man is out there, so the shield can protect the lady. He can move it in front of him, goes back. There's a lot of historical precedents and everything else that goes that, but most of it is, that's the way we've always been doing it. That's the way we're going to keep on doing it.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.
All righty.